Why is Ukraine fighting in Sudan? I thought they're supposed to be fighting their own battles up in Ukraine. Well, here's what's going on. Now, there's been tons of reports of Ukrainian special forces actually operating within Sudan, Africa, and we'll get through why they would be operating in there, but there's also a lot of drone footage coming out of Sudan, and when you look at a lot of the drone footage and look what language the POV cams are in, it's in Ukrainian. So stick with me in this video because Sudan, Africa is actually the perfect place for Ukrainian soldiers or special forces to be operating out of. Okay, so first things first, why is Russia even involved with Sudan? What does Sudan have to do with Russia? They have nothing in common other than the fact that they're both two countries. So what's going on? Well, it's actually quite simple. When Russia, Putin, was looking for a way to get into Africa, after they've sort of established themselves in Syria by using Wagner, they looked for a country or opportunity to get into Africa. And Sudan actually went to Russia and said, "We will be the opening gate for you to enter Africa. Come and help us and we'll give you something special." Now, statistically speaking, Sudan serves as the 10th largest gold producer in the world. And because of this, Sudan said, "We will give you a portion of our gold. If you come into our country, you need to help stabilize us. You need to open up arms trade." Again, it's more of a security thing. And this is how Wagner and Russia was actually able to gain influence and enter Africa, was because of Sudan and this gold exchange. Now, something else we need to understand is that Russia is aligning themselves with a group called the Rapid Support Forces. And these are the forces that are sort of in this civil war or a fight for power within Sudan. So the main factions in the Sudan civil war is the professional Sudanese military, and you have these rapid support forces. And where it gets a little confusing is that these forces were supposed to integrate together, but the issue is both of the commander of the forces wanted to take power of the entire military. So now you have two generals who are fighting one another and using their soldiers to essentially try to regain power of Sudan and to keep their position as generals. And again, if you are a general in these types of societies, you have ultimate power and authority, like we're seeing in other countries that are falling apart in Africa who use generals or coups to control their countries. And so you have Wagner fighters, Russia, who are aligning themselves with the Rapid Support Forces. And because of this, we now have reports that Ukraine is going after these guys. Now, interesting enough, the main evidence where people started to speculate that Ukraine might actually be in Sudan was the fact that there were a lot of POV cams coming out of the country of UAV strikes that looked oddly familiar to the attacks you're seeing in Ukraine versus Russia. This kamikaze style of taking a drone and taking somebody out directly. And people speculated, you know what? This kind of looks like Ukraine. You also started to see reports of Ukraine Zelensky meets Sudanese leader, discusses Russian paramilitaries. Okay, so when you have actual reports of when Zelensky was at the UN talking to Sudan, things are starting to line up and things are starting to make sense. You know what? Maybe Ukraine is looking to outsource and to fight Russia in a different way outside of Ukraine. And of course, this
remain as to the identity of those behind the attacks. Text on the monitor of the drone controller seen here is in Ukrainian. This is the first time drones like this have been deployed in this fashion in Africa.
And again, don't get this confused with the fact that drones have never been used in Africa, because one of the main perpetrators of drones being used in Africa is actually the United States, operating covertly within Niger. Now it's a lot more public because Niger is starting to fall apart themselves, and the United States has found themselves in the middle of the country. Nonetheless, the United States has said, yes, we have drone bases and we're operating around Africa. Again, don't get it confused. The style of combat and warfare, that the way drones are being used in Sudan really lines up with how Ukraine has managed to start using these drones. And again, this is confirmed, unconfirmed, but you're starting to see more and more media coming out of Telegram, Instagram, and other media sources who say they have verified that Ukrainians are training in Africa, fighting in Africa, and more specifically going after Russian interests within Africa. To them, it actually makes more sense to go after Russian interests outside of Ukraine, not in Russia, not even Crimea, but go to Africa. Go after these fighters who don't really have that much combat experience. They're not necessarily a rebel group, but they're not the best professional military. Let's fight them because we know we can take them out. And we're not going to go directly after Wagner. Yes, it would be nice to go after Wagner, but Wagner relies on rebel groups. They rely on paramilitaries to stay relevant. So go after them, not Wagner. Of course, Ukraine is doing what they know works. Use drones in a manner that no one has ever seen in Africa. Because even within Ukraine versus Russia, this is still a problem today where nobody really knows how to stop these drones just coming in from out of nowhere. You can use cages, you can use little drone zappers, but those hardly work because nonetheless, a lot of the times, these drones are still going to hit you. So why not do it in Sudan, especially to these groups backed by Wagner, who for sure doesn't have any anti-drone capabilities? Now, there's also been a lot of backlash and questions as to whether or not Ukraine is even allowed to be operating in Sudan and attacking Russian interests outside the scope of their conflict. Well, yes, especially if Zelensky has permission or has talked to the Sudanese president and leaders, of course they're allowed to fight in Africa. And if we're using the United States as an example, who also operates covertly within Africa, we are doing the exact same thing in Niger. We're really truly in Niger to fight enemies. You can't say the word on here that start with the letter T. These are really bad people. But we're also in Niger to kind of combat Russian interests because Russia is already spreading throughout what's called the Sahel region in this belt. So of course it makes sense. Why not send Ukraine there as well, since we're already partners and allies and we train together? When I was also doing some research for this video, I also saw some pro-Ukrainian groups who questioned this a little bit, where people said, well, doesn't it make more sense to have our best fighters go up and fight, in Ukraine, where we can use these special forces to keep pushing in Crimea, which is currently happening today at the time of this video? Well, what you need to understand is that every big major military uses these assets of special forces outside of the scope of what's called direct action, because direct action is really supposed to be used by big militaries like your tanks, your regular ground forces. And with the US military, special forces are more so used in covert operations, either training local militias, and hopefully these militias will help us, or attacking assets outside of the scope of a direct action like we see in Africa, where special forces are operating in Niger, not necessarily to directly fight the Russians, but to make sure the Russians know we are here. And that's what Ukraine is doing. Now, there are obviously going to be some negatives with Ukraine operating in Africa. It's not all positive, so let's call these out. First things first, Russia has already exploited the fact that Ukraine is losing more and more support. I mean, we can even look at the United States, who's willing to have their own government shutdown in support of Ukraine. Whether or not to give more and more money and support to Ukraine, it does look like we are going to give them more money, but nonetheless, Russia knows there is less support as the war drags on. And Russia definitely is hoping the war drags on and there will be less support for Ukraine. Now, if it comes out publicly that Ukraine is operating in Africa, like every country ever since the beginning of colonialization, they're going to have a lot of people hate on them, already more so than they do right now, because not everybody loves Ukraine. A lot of people do, but a lot of people don't. And especially when you start going into Africa, Russia has sort of been like the crusaders who go into Africa and say, we are here to save you from the West. We support you. We have the same story. The West is after us. Let's join together. And Ukraine aligns themselves with NATO. NATO is the West. So it wouldn't be out of the question if Russia starts to exploit the fact that Ukraine is in Africa and they're taking advantage of Africans. You see, Ukraine is doing what the West is doing. So we need to make sure that we call this out, because this could be the biggest negative for Ukraine if it does come out publicly. Now, if you ask me, I think eventually it will come out publicly that Ukraine probably is involved in Sudan. Again, there's a lot of evidence that proves so, and a lot of people coming out saying this is true. Nonetheless, for sure, wherever Russia is or Wagner, they will always try to discredit Ukraine, no matter where they are in the world. Something else we need to consider, especially operating within Sudan, there's almost zero US support or outside foreign support to help Ukraine and Sudan. So this might be for the first time where Ukraine will be testing themselves to see how they actually perform with other nations in combat or combat missions outside of their scope of being comfortable. Because this is not just special forces. I mean, we're talking almost on a level of like Delta Force or the Israeli Mossad. You're doing things that could impact an entire region, an entire country, and could also negatively impact your country. Because you have to understand, the United States evacuated Sudan when this entire civil war started. That's a whole nother issue. So this will be very interesting to see. If Ukraine is actually operating within Sudan and doing it all on their own, we have an entire new country, a new military, and Ukraine might be on their way to becoming a major superpower or powerhouse in the military scope to prove themselves they can actually operate covertly. And who's to say Sudan is not going to be the only target? Wagner is all over the world, and it looks like wherever Wagner is, Ukraine's going to be there also. So I do think this is an extremely smart move for Ukrainian special forces to be operating in Sudan. They can operate covertly. They don't have to necessarily wave the Ukrainian flag around. And also, it's actually rather low risk because you're fighting a group that's definitely outmatched and doesn't even know where these drones are coming from. And if it comes down to it, I'm sure Ukrainians are probably way better trained and can engage in direct action if need be. But of course, Wagner, Russia, this is bad for them because they need to hold Sudan. Russia will do whatever it takes to send more and more assets into Sudan to make sure Ukraine is not using Sudan as a battlefield because they need the gold. Without that gold in Sudan, Russia is in major trouble. So of course, Ukraine realizes, let's bring the fight to Sudan. We're not even going to fight Russia directly. We're going to fight the assets around Russia. And look, we don't know if this is confirmed, unconfirmed. I'm sure we'll find out in the near future. But if Zelensky is talking to the Sudanese leader, you have POV camps with Ukrainian text on it. It makes total sense for Ukrainian special forces to be doing covert operations outside of Sudan. This is a new Ukrainian force. They're getting better and better. They're getting really good training from the United States, from NATO, and they're using that training outside of the scope of just operating in trench warfare, sending some troops to Crimea. They're going covert. They're leaving their borders and they're taking the fight to Russia, even in Africa.